Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. Welcome to the Sowetan Dialogue. Been really looking forward to this. Ikamalam Ngunwabisa Makunga, editor of the Sowetan, and thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to my guests, who I will introduce in a minute. Tonight, we are discussing this book, The Sting in the Tail. One of the best, by the way, that I've read recently. I was just telling my guests off air now. Really, absolutely enjoyed it. It is written by Marion Sparg. It is the life and times of our former head of the NPA, Mr. Bulelani Ngcuka. And speaking about him, I want to introduce him. Mr. Ngcuka, thank you so much for joining us, and good evening. You are muted. You can just unmute yourself and then just come on board. Yes.
Good evening, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Marion will not be able to switch on her camera at the moment, and we have excused her essentially for as far as that is concerned for the conversation. But she's very much here with us, and I'm sure she can hear us. Marion, good evening.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for having us.
And then my last guest, all the way from Gqeberha, I hope you guys have water there, Ongama. Ongama Mtimka, based at the Nelson Mandela University in Gqeberha, and a political analyst who's joining us this evening. Ongama, how are you doing?
Very well. We're still quenching our thirst somehow. Thank you, and good evening to you and your viewers.
Guys, and we really hope that we really don't hit the day zero that everybody's anticipating. So if you want to join this conversation, please do feel free to post any questions, any comments that you may have on the platform on which you are joining. We should be able to see them. Our technical producer will assist us in keeping the conversation with you and keeping you as part of it. I want to say welcome and say, as I've just said to Mr. Ngcuka, that I really did enjoy this book. Many of us had been anticipating it. And interestingly, as we're chatting now off air, is that we really thought, okay, the way that it is structured, we thought, yes, you will start with your childhood, and then, it kind of goes. And I think what it does give us, which is something quite important, is really, and a lot of your legacy has often been defined by the Zuma moment. A lot of, what people kind of, know you for is that Zuma moment. But what this book really does, it gives us a very good background, not just of your life, but of everything really that you've done, as well as building South African institutions. It takes us into a very important part of our democracy, right from its infancy, and a lot of the work that really went into it. We look forward to it. It is now here. Tell us a little bit about why you decided to write your story, and in particular in the way that you have.
Thanks very much. As I was saying, thanks for hosting us. I have been asked by many people to record some of the events that occurred throughout my life. And I've sort of been reluctant to do so, because I thought that some people thought that I'll use this opportunity to settle some scores. And I really didn't want to do that. But I think that as I was getting older, my kids started asking me questions about why I did what I did and where was I at a particular point in time. And I thought that it's important for them, really, that we record some of these events. And the way it has turned out, I think that it's just worked well for us because some of these records, they are not there. For example, the NPA, they have not recorded some of those early days when we were there. So that's really why I thought we should do this. But most importantly, of course, there was Marion, who was nagging me all the time that we must do this book. She wanted to do two books, and wanted to one on Chris Hani and then the other one on myself. And she wanted to start with me. So eventually I agreed. Well, we thought that many people think that my life revolves around the Zuma issue. And so we thought that let's get it out of the way. That's why we started with it. Let's just get it out of the way, and then people can focus on some of the things that I have done in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really want to start here, Mr. Ngcuka, and I'll come to Marion just now, but I really want to start here. I mean, one of the most perhaps pivotal moments for me, having read the book, is a man who really, really inspired you, from the young man that you were at the time, Griffiths Mxenge. You talk very fondly about him. Many of us obviously know him, as far as what we've read and all of that. But he's really was probably one of the best legal minds in South Africa, and really went on to inspire your life and perhaps how everything kind of turned out as far as your own career trajectory. Do you want to tell us about GM, as you call him?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. He's one person who really inspired me. And to a certain extent, I think I am where I am because of him. I first met GM in 1977, really. He was doing a bail application for students from Tembalabantu, students who were arrested during the uprisings there. And I was very impressed with the way he handled that case. It was very seldom for us to see Africans were challenging the system in the manner in which he did. And I felt that, hey, this is the man I want to work with. And so I approached my former lecturer, Templeton Bulelani, who was practicing in King Lamstown at the time, and asked him to speak to GM on my behalf, which he did. And then GM invited me to go and join him. It was very, very interesting. I mean, those were really exciting times for us. We had probably about 5 African advocates. It was Louis Quay, Pius Langa, Boyce Moerane, Justice Poswa, Vuka Shabala. And then we had another guy, Casey Naidu. You might remember him during the HIFA Commission. And those are the people whom we work with, and we kept them on brief throughout their careers. We handled mostly political work throughout the breadth and length of our country. The first case that I was drawn into was the case of Zephaniah Mtuping, who was the leader of the PAC at the time. It was Zeph Mtuping and 18 others, which was being handled in Bethel, because the regime didn't want to have the case handled in Johannesburg. They wanted it to be far away so that people can be tried away from their supporters. That case was an eye-opener for us, and for me in particular, because it was the first political trial that I was involved with. And GM was there to guide me throughout that process. We then went on to do the trial of Nohle Mohapi, who was suing the state for the death of her husband, Mapetla Mohapi, who died in detention in King Lamstown. And then we also did the trial of Lydia Mdluli, whose husband was also killed in detention by the security police. His name was Joseph Mdluli. And then went on to do quite a number of trials. And that's how I also was initiated into politics, because most of those cases that we were doing, these were political cases, and we came to sympathize with the people who were being tried. And the cases themselves, it was very difficult to win some of those cases, even though the evidence was very scanty, because the judges themselves were very sympathetic to the regime and opposed to what we were trying to do. I mean, I remember of course, the other case that we did was the case of Maduna, Penuel Maduna, and others. We defended him, and fortunately, he was acquitted. And then we did the case of Joseph Mange. Now, interestingly, in that case, Yabo Mange, once we were defending them, and we got to court one day, they said, sorry, we don't want you. We don't want any lawyers here. We are going to defy the regime. And so they'll get to court, they'll smoke in court, they will sing as the trial was proceeding. And they didn't have any legal representation. As a result of that, they got hefty sentences. And Mange received a death sentence, which fortunately was commuted on appeal. And so that's the man who initiated me into all these cases and working with all these other advocates. And I was fortunate in that I worked with some of the best brains in the country, and I learned from the best.
And then he gets killed, of course, probably in the most brutal way that one can think of. And I want to ask this question kind of in twofold. What did his life teach you about courage? And what did his death teach you about betrayal, particularly betrayal of a cause?
Yes. GM knew no fear. He was really fearless. I remember, again, I go back to Bulelani, my lecturer. He used to say, hey, man, you know. He really doesn't care for those boys. Indeed, that was so. GM really had no fear. And sometimes, I mean, I remember he applied for a passport and wouldn't get a passport. And so he applied now for a travel document, which allowed him to travel to Swaziland and Botswana and Lesotho. We were going to do a case in Lesotho on commission, taking evidence from Tenjwa Mthinzi. And so the security police had to go and interview him. So he was invited to the security police and he asked us to accompany him. And some of us were not used to go to the headquarters of the security police. And GM said, no, come, let's go, so that if they decide to detain me there, there's somebody who can tell the story. He was laughing at us because we were scared and he wasn't, because he had gotten used to them. I mean, you know, there's something that I don't think it's in the book, but let me tell you the story. When GM was detained, he was in solitary confinement for quite some time. The police came and told him that his wife had had a miscarriage. And so GM sat there and mourned the death of his child. And then when he appeared in court after a couple of months, Sisinyami came with his son Umbasa carrying him. And GM asked, who is this? He said, no, this is your son. He said, no, but my son died. I mean, my kid died. He said, no. The police never told him. They were lying to him all the time when he was there. I mean, that's a sad story. That's how these guys, they treated him. What did I learn from GM about being afraid? I suppose I learned from him that when you have a cause to fight for, you must continue with that. That there will be a number of obstacles on your way, but you must never give up. He was asked to give evidence against Abu Herigwala and others, and he refused. Fortunately for him, Abu Herigwala, they admitted the evidence which they had wanted him to give. And so I learned from him that you can't cooperate with the regime. And so when my time came for me to give evidence against my guys, it was a given that I'm going to refuse, and I did. Now, the question of betrayal, you know, until we had the evidence, until the evidence came out now in 78 or so, from Mama Sela and so forth, we really didn't know who had killed GM, except that we suspected that it was the police. And so when Dirk Kutsi and others, it confirmed what we had already suspected. So again, it reinforced this thing that when you are in the struggle, death is not far from you. You expect that you're going to be killed, but it's not something that you sit and be moping about all the time, but you know that it's possible, it can happen anytime. And it's not something that is going to hinder you from performing what you have to do.
Absolutely.
I've been long-winded, I'm sorry.
Not a problem. Marion, I want to come to you. I mean, you did this work. You, as Bulelani says, you were the one who was nagging him, to put the story down. You've known him for a while, worked with him. In this project, is there anything perhaps, or what is it that, in hindsight, when you think about it now, that you may have not even realized at the time, may not have known him? What are the lessons that you believe that this life, and which, as we read in this book, are giving to us as somebody who was close to the process, not only of the process of writing, but actually, in having worked with him as well?
Thank you, Nobisa. I think the first lesson, and it's really a lot of the reason why I decided that we had to do this book, is how important it is to record our history. In the case of Bulelani, as we've said in some of the publicity around the book, there are few people that have been as contested as he is in our recent political history. Everyone has got something to say about Bulelani. And it was important for me for his voice to be heard. Having worked with him, for so long and been with him through so much of the processes at the NPA and at Parliament, as I say, it was really important for me that they heard his story. As we all know, he's usually associated, and understandably so, with the Zuma case. And so he needed to talk about that, but within the context of his much bigger role in our struggle for democracy. In terms of how important all the lessons, I think the importance of the book in our current political situation, there are few institutions, I think, that are as important today as the National Prosecuting Authority. And if there's one person that South Africa needs to hear from, it is our first National Director of Public Prosecutions. So yes, I think that's the importance of the book for me. Thanks.
I see, Duncan, there's a question that you have, which I will pose to Marion now, and just give her time to ponder perhaps on it, and we can answer it a bit later on while I go to Ngama. So, and Duncan is asking Marion and saying that he's read the book. Why didn't the book cover Bulelani's life after the NPA? To be honest, I also did have that question, but I will park it for now, and I want to go to Ngama. Ngama, you were very excited. I mean, I always call on you for this kind of stuff, to say, look, let's have a conversation about this, and I think it was really big because it's not only about our recent past, but it's, as Marion says, it's very relevant to our now, and particularly if you look at our institutions now. I mean, what were your big takes as far as what happened during Bulelani's time, and how it may really relate to the way things are now with our public institutions?
Thank you, Nabi. So I think I'm going to answer the question in an ethnographic approach that reflects also on my own journey, because I find the book healing in many ways. So first of all, and I think that you drew on this in your discussion with him, that the story of courage comes very, very strongly. And the forays of the National Prosecuting Authority during his time are quite interesting, in the sense that here you have a person who's got a sense of a need to fight and build a professional organization, while at the same time mindful of the history of the country. And I think he says this in the first chapter, that there was a sort of a dual consciousness, if I can put it that way, in terms of which he was mindful of the role and the gaze of the public on him in enabling a national prosecuting authority that could rise to the occasion in terms of its professional conduct and actually having a sting. But at the same time, here's a person who says, I was also conscious that I had inherited the people who were working here. And in fact, that the agenda that they had, I had to be doubtful about, and constantly, negotiate this thing of being an enabler for people who want to work for the benefit of the country, while at the same time always checking the extent to which, their agenda may have been other than what a national prosecuting authority should have been. So I quite enjoyed listening to him talk about that. The other takeaway for me was a very interesting one. And in fact, it comes at a time when I'm beginning to ponder the position that the NPA finds itself in now in terms of the relationship between the political and the prosecutorial, if you like. That one, they've got to play this role of, if they're going to be pursuing high-profile political cases, there's almost a burden to manage the political risks associated with that. And that includes how to relate with the direct political principal, the minister, as well as the president. So that's interesting for me, how he was handling that. And in fact, I have my own question about what he thinks are the principles that underlie how he was managing political risks, at least in briefing the president, about the case that they're writing about in the first chapter, and the fact that there's a sensitivity to the extent to which politicians have got an influence on, especially prosecutorial processes. And I think my last takeaway, Nwami, is what I started about in terms of what I think is healing in the book. So a very silly and very dangerous message has been driven by politicians proper, if I can put it that way. The idea that we liberated the country, and those who liberated the country were, politicians proper or career politicians. Sorry to put it that way, because there was nothing career in fighting the struggle, even though, being involved in politics in a lifelong journey has tended to be a career move post-apartheid. But acknowledging that, there's a very dangerous narrative that they have entrenched and in fact have exploited, that they who were involved either in the military of the ANC or, in civil, in conducting politics in communities, were more political or more true liberators than those who were professionals and had a professional development trajectory which brought them in politics. So I mean, so I asked myself, what was his own professional development that gave him the courage, and it was so lovely to see that his progression was in fact a professional development. So the question about Waupi Chief, which gets to be asked from us who have grown up in a South Africa that is free, but have needed to nurture a particular professional development trajectory that contributes to the advancement of transformation in the country, is no less because there were even people who waged struggle in the apartheid times who were in fact professionals, and their professional status being the one that adds significant value to the advance of struggle. And in fact, post-apartheid, that very professionalism becomes the one that saves us from liberators who turn rogue.
Mm.
Those are my three biggest takeaways.
Thank you for that, Ongs. Mr. Ngcuka, I want to unpack a little bit some of what Ongama is saying, right? So the one really is about, I mean, the reason why you were chosen as the NPA head was very much because you were qualified for it. So the professionalism that he talks about, it was kind of obvious that you were not only qualified but actually probably competent, to do that kind of work. But you also, is a person who came from that background of having been an activist, right? So you've got essentially these two factors, which is that yes, I'm absolutely a legal person and I'm competent and we're starting this, and you're probably also driven by a consciousness that you had carried, and you begin to build this institution. And in that process, of course, there are challenges and all, and all of that. Then comes the point where you have to say the work that we need to do, uncomfortable as it may be, it needs to be done regardless of what the pressure that it will bring upon me, in terms of politics. So to speak to us about that, in particular with regards to the saying that says you've got to deliver justice while you're trying to also balance the pressures that may come at you politically.
Thanks very much. And thanks, Ongama. I mean, I appreciate your comments very much. I take that to heart. Nabi, it was a very difficult balancing act that one had to go through. One of the things that I really has been driving me was to ensure that we're able in this country to establish the rule of law. That was very important for us. You must remember that when we were legal activists, we were pushing the boundaries of freedom through law, even though the law was oppressing us. And therefore, we had to find ways and means of using law to achieve our political objectives. And now the scale has changed. Here we are, having fought so hard to attain and achieve and get this constitution that we fought for. It became important for us that we're able to implement that constitution and ensure that we establish in this country the rule of law. And one of the critical things about it is simply this. We know that we must ensure that there's justice, but really the purpose behind justice to ensure that there's justice and there's rule of law is so that people can live in conditions of freedom and order. That's really is the purpose. And so if you are a legal activist, what you want to do is to ensure that there is justice. And you want to ensure that there's justice so that people can be free. So those things go together. And so when it comes to, when you have to do the balancing act, one of the things that were critical for me was to build the capacity, because the state had no capacity at that time. We started a new organization. We have no people coming from your side. You inherit an institution. The prosecution was sucking from the hind teeth, as it were. And most importantly, it did not enjoy legitimacy in the eyes of the public. Prosecutors were regarded as people who were collaborators and who were working for the system that was oppressing all of us. And so you'll find that defense lawyers had more legitimacy in the eyes of the public than the prosecutors. And you find that also the bright and the best will join the prosecution just as they finish in school and then leave and go and work in the private sector because they make more money, but also in terms of their status, they've got a better status than the prosecutor. And so I wanted to change those things and begin to put across this thing that prosecutors actually are the lawyers for the people, because they are the ones who are out there who do the work and prosecute on behalf of. So they are the ones who are the lawyers for the people. There is this thing that whatever they do, you're not doing it for ourselves, but for others. And so you come into the organization. At that time, I'll be honest with you, I had at the back of my head that sooner or later, I'm going to be butting heads with some of my fellow comrades. It was at the back of my head. But at that time, you must remember that we were activists. We believed in this higher calling. We believed that as people are engaged in the liberation of our country, we can't do the things that the apartheid regime was doing. So I'll be honest with you, I did not think that our people would be engaged in corrupt activities so early after we attained our liberation. And so it was at the back of my head that yes, we'll do, but most probably it will be some of the junior officials and civil servants that we'll deal with. But when I was confronted with some of the cases that I was to deal with, it was an eye-opener. And so I had to deal with it. I didn't believe, as I say in the book, because I inherited some of the white prosecutors who were there in the past, who had prosecuted ourselves. I didn't believe that those people had turned already, and that therefore these are the people who believe in democracy and in human rights. But I was clear that I am not going to be firing anybody. I'm going to keep everybody on board and begin to transform the organization over a period of time, which is what we did. But also I was clear that there are some of those cases which are not political, ordinary criminal cases, that those people have acquired skills and they're able to deal with some of those cases. And so I knew that some of them really did not trust me, just as much as I didn't trust them. And therefore, we were watching each other, you know. And so when I had to deal with some of these political pressures, I was disappointed, to be honest with you. I was disappointed that some of my own comrades were engaged in some of these activities. And I felt that the cases must be done, whether it's my comrades or not comrades, because the important thing is to ensure that there's a rule of law, not a rule for some.
I mean, it does come across in the book, certainly, your disappointment, that is. But I must say, one of the things that also comes across, and it makes me ask the questions, because we are not, I mean, we're just, you know, outside of the system, as it were, and perhaps not really sure how these things worked, or at least worked at the time. There seems to have been, and I think Ngama alluded to that, there seems to have been a particular closeness that you, as the head of the NPA at the time, had with perhaps your political principles. So whether it was the minister at the time, whether it was the president, Madiba included. And having read the book and finding instances where perhaps you have conversations with them about particular cases, I found myself raising eyebrows to say, is this the norm? Was there anything, is there anything, I mean, I hear what the content of the conversations, but just that as a matter of principle in itself, is there something that should be accepted? At which point do we, perhaps as a South African public, ought to have been concerned that here's the head of the NPA having particular conversations with political principals about particular cases or people that they're investigating? Where is the balance? At which point do we get concerned about the integrity, I suppose, of the processes?
Thank you. Thanks for that question. It's very important. In terms of the law, the Minister of Justice exercises final responsibility over the National Prosecuting Authority. So to that extent, there has to be a close relationship between the Minister and the National Director. And the Minister must be kept informed about the work that the organization is doing. Because at the end of the day, you do the work on behalf of, you represent the state. You don't represent yourself. And so it is important that the functionaries of the state are kept informed, particularly about the important cases that may have serious political repercussions. So you can't just be naive and say, I'm going to do these things and not inform. There's a difference between informing and seeking approval from them. You understand the difference? So I inform the president because it is important that the president has to know, particularly on matters that involve senior members of government. So the president must be kept informed, but you do not seek his endorsement of what you are going to do. That would be wrong. That would be interference, which is prohibited. So that's what I did. Madiba was no longer the president at the time. When he approached me, in fact, he approached me, did two things. The first one was when he approached me around the Zuma matter, because the matter was all over the newspapers. And he needed to know what was happening. And given his role and status in society, I thought that it was important that I briefed him, which I did. Again, I was just informing. It was a courtesy just to inform him. But the interesting thing about him was that he came back to me one day and said, my son, I love the work that you do. What can I do to help you? And so I said, please, our problem is that we need unmarked cars for intelligence work. So which he then did, and he collected, he got 2 cars from Ford in PE, no, from Delta. It was Delta at the time, which we collected. And then he phoned me to say I must go and collect 2 cars from Hyundai. And I said, no, Madiba, sorry that I can't do that. We're investigating this man. And Madiba kept quiet for some time. And then he said, please take the cars and then arrest him, which is what, of course, we did. And the other matter that Madiba brought to me...
Clarify. Excuse me, so let me just clarify that the person you're talking about was a person who owned the company. Yes. At the time, and there were investigations that you guys were conducting. And there goes Madiba, being Madiba, not knowing of the investigation, approaching these companies, and the person makes the companies available. And you go and you inform him to say, Madiba, actually, we can't because we are investigating this person. And so you say he I think in the book you write about how he was silent for a while and then basically said, well, take the cars and arrest him.
Yes, which is exactly what we did. And the other matter, of course, which Madiba then approached me, there were 2 matters that Madiba approached me and asked me to do. The first one was to investigate the death of Samora Machel, because it was important for the family. And we did, we spent a lot of time and a lot of resources there. But unfortunately, we couldn't make the breakthrough that we wanted. So that was really to the extent. And the other one was Madiba had gone to Indonesia and he had received money from Indonesia for the ANC. And he came back. He was then traveling with the late Thomas Ngcuka. He was the treasurer then of the ANC. And he came back. When he came back, he went straight to Cape Town. And the money was given to Nkobi. Unfortunately, Nkobi had a stroke and was then taken to KZN by Shabir. And he never recovered, and he died shortly thereafter. And so Madiba asked me to investigate that case, and we did, but we couldn't. By the time it came to us, the trade was cold. We couldn't make any headway. So that was the extent to which I was interacting with the leadership. Again, the principle, as I say, was inform, but the decision is yours, finally.
And so comes a period where Jacob Zuma, then deputy president, there are obviously allegations against him. The team begins to investigate him. You are in Grahamstown one weekend, enjoying the Grahamstown, the Makanda Festival, I believe now it is called. And you get a phone call that basically says to you, from your team member, basically saying to you that they've got evidence against Mr. Zuma. And you speak, I think, about how your heart sank, and because now you kind of were confronting what would perhaps become a very difficult reality, in the days going forward. And I'm not sure, I cannot remember which one came first, but there was a point where you went to speak to Mr. Zuma. And again, I want to go back to the question that I just asked now about having those conversations. So Mr. Zuma was now a person who was being investigated. And you had a conversation with him where, of course, you do talk a little bit in the book about what that conversation was about. But the very principle of, I suppose, meeting him as a person who was being investigated by your team is, again, would it not be raising concerns to an ordinary member of the public about how these things are done procedurally?
Yes, so certainly. Now, let me take a few steps back. we launched this investigation. We try as much as possible to protect it. We do a couple of things. One, when we apply for a search warrant, when we go to court, we did not disclose the name of the person. In other words, the deputy president's name was not disclosed. We said it's Mr. X. We also, when we were to do the searches, we did not search the offices of the deputy president. And the matter then was leaked. The person who identified the deputy president's name was Shabir in the court papers when he challenged our search warrants. So he's the one who identified his name. And the matter then got into the newspapers. It was all over the place. I go into meetings of the security cluster, and the man is there. And he knows these things are happening all around him. And how do I look him in the eye? And so I then said, no, let me go and tell him, because he's reading about these things about himself. Let me go and tell him that we have an investigation. These are the allegations. We're going to do this investigation. And once we are done with the investigation, at that time I said to him, I have confidence in you, Deputy President. I think the investigation will be able to clear. It's important that it be done. And he says, and he welcomed it. And he said, thank you very much. And he's certain that the investigation is going to clear him. Unfortunately, it didn't clear him. So it was important that we do so, that I tell him that this is what we do, and I tell him in his face. Mustn't think that we're involved in some skullduggery. Remember, here we're dealing with the deputy president. Ordinarily, we never disclose whom we're investigating because it might turn out that in fact there was no basis for the allegations and that the people were innocent. And so we never really disclose who we're investigating. But once this one was in the public domain, I think it was critical that I inform him.
I want to bring Marion to this question, just as a follow-up on that, perhaps. Do you think, Marion, that any perception of irregularity, whether it was there or not, do you think any perception of irregularity, particularly around the visit to the president, to the then Mr. Zuma, do you think it may be justified in any way or form?
Thanks, Narvisa. Yes, the question. It's an important question, and one understands the concern, and it's justified in the sense that clarity is required. I think, as Bulelani said earlier on, it's naive to think that you can be a national director of public prosecutions and simply ignore politics. I think one also has to accept that, as Bulelani has also said, that when one is investigating a deputy president or a president, or as later turned out after Bulelani had left, a national commissioner of the South African police, one cannot treat these cases as ordinary cases, not because the individuals themselves have any particular importance and are above the law, but because of the positions they hold. These investigations, if not managed properly, can have serious ramifications for the country as a whole. And that is why I say you cannot ignore politics as the head of the NPA. It is, as you said, something that needs to be managed very carefully. It's always going to be a tricky issue and a contested issue. And in the end, you're relying on the caliber, the quality of the individuals holding these posts, whether it's the national director or the minister or the president. But at the same time, we do have a constitutional democracy. And as we've seen, while some people may refer to issues as lawfare and using the courts as sort of political playgrounds, etc., the fact is we do have a constitutional democracy, and concerns like this can actually be aired and taken to court. But yeah, to answer your question briefly, I think the concern is a valid one. certainly in my experience with Bulelani, and as he tells the story himself, I certainly never had any doubts about political interference in any of the decisions that he took.
And Marion, I want to ask this question to you first, and I will come to Bulelani. He stands very much firmly by that decision. And I say that decision, the decision to not prosecute the former president. And although he obviously had said to the country, look, there was a prima facie case that he believed that the man ought to answer, but he chose not to. And I want to ask you first, Marion, what do you make of that, particularly looking at what happened sort of immediately after that, the fallout, how South Africa reacted, how each of the quarters, political landscape reacted. What do you make of the fact that at that decision he took, but also it's a decision that to this day, even in hindsight, he stands by?
It's a difficult question for me to answer. There's no way. Bulelani was qualified to be a National Director of Public Prosecutions. I certainly was not and am not. And so there's no way in which I can attempt to I simply don't have the qualifications or the expertise to second guess the decision he took not to prosecute. But in terms of its ramifications, I think, decisions come with consequences. And that is consequences in this case for the country and for the individual, for Bulelani himself and his family, as he goes on to tell his story in the ensuing chapters in the book. But in terms of the ramifications for the country and this big debate about what does prima facie mean, et cetera, which is something I think Bulelani has explained, in other interviews about the difference between sufficient evidence and prima facie evidence, etc. But one cannot avoid the consequences of any decisions, and to me it's a bit pointless because it's playing a what-if game. You could say, well, what if he had taken a decision to prosecute the president, and what if the country had, erupted, and then the case was lost because the evidence was not solid. And so there are so many scenarios. It's a guessing game for me. And I think the ultimate lesson is that, one takes a decision and you stand by that decision.
Absolutely. Ongama, I think we probably, as people who read and follow politics, we really probably agonized over what Mr. Ngcuka says, in the book regarding, yes, he took the decision, this is what happened, and this is why he took the decision. Again, the whole principle of balancing, in the interest of justice, but also not being blind to potential ramifications of that decision. Are you convinced? Do you think that he makes a convincing case in this book about how he handled the matter, not only from a legal point of view, but essentially politically, having to consider essentially those political implications? Are you satisfied that he makes a convincing case? Ongs, I think you're muted.
I think maybe two things for me with respect to that. One, and I think that Marion just made a reference to this. Decisions about political economic phenomena are very tough and they've got consequences. And when they are made in good faith, people who make them are not afraid to be transparent about the decisions, one, and two, to defend them in public. People who make decisions in bad faith, one, don't want to be accountable about them and don't want to be transparent about them. And this is what I've seen, with people who've got a very strong professional and a commitment to a greater ideal than, the political imperatives of the day, is their willingness to be transparent about their decision. So I have looked at his body language, or in fact, the way he answers the question in the book, and I'm satisfied across the board that the decision was made by somebody who, one, remains accountable and transparent about it. And as such, I take that it was made in good faith. The second part to that question for me is a question about political risk, which in fact is interesting that the NPA finds itself at exactly the same position that an immediate post-democratic, post-apartheid NPA found itself in. The institution is recovering from a period in which it was counted among the president's keepers, if you like, to borrow from Jacques Paul. And the argument, in fact, so the feeling, at least from Shamila Batoy, is that it was so rotten that she even, boldly said what she found there was like, a shadow of what the organization used to be. I can't remember the exact words, but they were very unkind in terms of what she. Now it must rebuild itself, but contend with very tough political decisions. And for me, it's an interesting one that, and in fact, going back to the question you were raising earlier on about the relationship between the political sphere and the prosecutorial or administrative sphere. What does Shamila Batoy do in an environment where she has to prosecute people who, who are avowed anti-rule of law and anti-constitutionalists, but at last have found or have fired a salvo that has potential to stick in the form of the current allegations against the president? So in the conduct of political risk management and managing the political briefings of the president, how do you contend with the fact that you must brief a president who's facing an onslaught from a group who are avowed anti-rule of law, anti-constitutionalists? And by the way, you also have a question about when you are going to act against the president. So my emerging thought is that we've arrived at a stage where the political sponsorship or the political backing or support, which allows you to make decisions as a professional, even though you may brief your political principles, has kind of gotten murky a little bit. And so how that relationship, what may have been permissible at the time when you had a president who was not necessarily embroiled in any scandal that necessitated your focus and attention, is going to be different at a time when, in fact, very soon or later, you are going to have to deal with the president, who you acknowledge that he's been a key ally in rebuilding your institution, but now happens to find themselves, in a quagmire of the nature that we have seen.
Mr. Ngcuka, I'm going to Ongama's second point shortly, but first, sure. I want to give you the opportunity. I know you've answered this question a gazillion times, and I'll ask you to answer it one more time. Many people say sure. It's about doing justice, though heavens may fall. Let justice be though hell. Very briefly, why did you decide not to prosecute Mr. Zuma?
Okay. It's a very, very simple analysis. As I said, we had a prima facie case against him. But that when we reviewed and weighed the evidence, we didn't think that we had a winnable case. In other words, we did not have sufficient evidence for us to get a conviction. And so when you therefore deal with the deputy president, or even the president for that matter, you better make sure that you take a case that you are almost certain that you are going to win. If you have doubt, then don't do it. The easiest thing for me, I must tell you, would have been to charge Mr. Zuma. That would have been an easy thing. Pin it down and then we're saying prosecute, or they said, oh, sorry, the guy said I must charge you. But that would have been wrong. because I myself was not convinced that we had sufficient evidence to do that for a number of reasons. I'll mention just one or two. The first one was that the evidence against Mr. Zuma was fairly circumstantial based on correspondence. These were letters were written by a number of people about Zuma, not by himself. That was the first thing. The second thing, I wasn't certain, Nwabisa, that we were going to be able to get that encrypted fax. It was going to be admissible as evidence, which was a critical part of the evidence. And also I was worried about the witness that we had. So I was worried about the witness. I was worried about the admissibility of the encrypted facts. I was worried about the circumstances around which we received that. And then the other part of it is, there's a letter that Mr. Zuma signed, which went to Scopa, in which he was saying that Scopa must stop investigating the arms deal, which was taken by the team as evidence of Zuma now protecting Thales and them from the investigation, that the mere writing of that. But I knew that the letter was written by Mbeki. Zuma merely signed it, and he was carrying out the orders of Mbeki in doing that. And so you couldn't attach blame to Zuma for that. And that letter was used as evidence in the case of Shabir Sheikh, to prove this relationship between, but I knew that was wrong because Zuma didn't write the letter. That's a fact. So based on all those things, but in addition to that, it's not just a decision that I took alone. I brought in senior members of the prosecution who were a bit distant from the investigation so that we can bring objectivity to it. I asked them to review the case. They reviewed the case. They came to the conclusion that it would be dangerous to charge the deputy president when we did not have sufficient evidence. I took this a step further. I engaged the services of a very senior counsel in the bar. Said, look at this case, and this is the decision that I am going to take. Tell me, what do you think I should do? His advice was that I was right, that it would be dangerous to charge the deputy president. So I'm satisfied that I did all the right things, that I took the decision as Ongama was saying, in good faith. As I mentioned, that it would have been so easy for me to say, come, let's charge this man. Remember that at that time, he was all over the place, accusing me of being a spy and leveling all sorts of allegations against me. It would have been nicer to hit back at him, but it would have been wrong because I'd be abusing the law and abusing the courts to fight my own battles, which I didn't want to do.
Of course, I understand you are not involved in the current case against him. But I think there are questions, though. I mean, the evidence you had at the time, you're saying that was circumstantial. And I understand, of course, as time has gone by, it is quite possible that the NPA has managed to get more evidence. And I understand some matters of this case have been amended and all of that. But based on just the genesis of the case, which you were very much intimately involved with at the time, why do you think now that the NPA is confident in what they have and they're pursuing the case?
Well, I still continue to be engaged with this case, madam, because in every application that Zuma has made to court, he still drags my name in. And so I have to be continuously deposing to affidavits. Even in the current case, I've had to do an affidavit for that. So I continue to be involved, not because I want to, but because he drags me into it. And so I'm familiar with the charges that are currently before the court. They're different from the charges that would have been preferred against him at the time when I was there. They have managed to collect more evidence subsequently to that. So you can see even the charges are very much different. So it's different.
You're saying that he continues to drag you into the case, and I imagine particularly with the issue around the spy tapes. And it would be amiss, I think, of me not to skip that and maybe ask to skip that and ask this one particular question. That conversation between yourself and Mr. McCarthy, I mean, you speak about it in the book and you allude to it really being, banter. Of course, we understand the fact that it should not have been leaked. We understand how wrong, that was. But I just want to go to really the nitty-gritty of the conversation itself, right?
Sure.
And you allude to it, as something that was really banter between, people. And you talk about how Mr. Mshe at the time had already decided to charge Mr. Zuma before the Bulelani conference. And your view was obviously different. And the question, though, is why did that conversation happen? It wasn't clear to me why Mr. McCarthy was having that conversation with you, regardless of whether it was pre-Bulelani and all of that. But considering the fact that it was this is the person that the NPA had decided we're going to charge sooner or later, why were you part of that conversation?
Okay. There are a number of reasons for that, but let's just deal firstly with the reality, with what happened. Mshe took the decision when to charge, right? On the advice of Billy and them. And he went on to see the minister, who was Bridget Mabandla at the time, and told him that he has decided he's going to charge before the conference. And Bridget told him that, no, you're wrong. That's a bad idea. You can't do that. You will cause so much bloodshed in this country. Don't do it. Wait. So Mshe agreed. He came back and informed Billy and them that he has taken this decision. He's not going to charge before the conference. Billy then puts into writing. He protests and he puts this into writing, sends the letter to Mshe and sends it to Leonard to complain to Leonard and ask Leonard to persuade Mshe to change his mind. At that time, Leonard is away on leave. So decision is taken. Leonard calls me in the nature of things. We talk, I mean, as a friend, we talk about all manner of things. And he tells me that they've decided that they're going to go and charge. Something that was totally not true. It wasn't going to happen. But me, I took it seriously. And I tell him, you will be fools to do that. It's wrong. Please don't do that. You'll be playing into the hands of all these people. Zuma is a candidate, is standing for elections. Don't do it. These are things that happen when, we talk as lawyers, we talk to each other about those things. But at the end, final analysis, the decision is theirs, not mine. The mere fact that I talk to you does not mean that I am influencing you. Now, all the lawyers will tell you that we talk about these things and we talk about these cases, but in final analysis, the decision is that of Mshe. So there was absolutely nothing wrong with that conversation, because I was not asking him to go and commit a crime. I was not telling him, I was telling him that, please don't do something that is wrong. So I'm very comfortable with that conversation.
Ngama? Yes, please do come in.
So it's interesting, Nabi. A theme here is that wrong is not wrong legal practice. Wrong is political risk. And this is a very interesting theme for me, which directors, I guess now, national directors of public prosecutions have to contend with. And the question is, to what extent should political risk be a factor? I mean, look at the Constitutional Court issue as well. They direct the imprisonment of Mr. Zuma, and the proverbial hits the fan in the country. Now, the question is, at what stage must the butterfly stop flapping its wings, because the act might generate a tornado elsewhere in the world? So that question is not actually attempting to minimize the importance of managing political risks in the conduct of prosecution, But I think it's very important to have Mr. Ngcuka maybe reply as well that at what stage does managing political consequences of, either court judicial decisions or decisions about prosecutions becomes a perhaps, because I mean the Constitution is very clear. The mandate to manage national security is an executive and a parliamentary responsibility. I don't know. I mean, it would be good to if you have time, Nwambi, for him to respond directly to that question.
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Mr. Ngcuka.
Sure. No, I mean, that's a constant. There's this thing called public interest. It falls, what you're talking about, managing these political risks and political consequences, it falls into the category of public interest. You have to consciously take that into account at all times. It becomes part and parcel of the decision making. You see, the prosecutor has to decide when to charge, decide which charges is going to prefer against the person, all right? And that is within the discretion of the prosecution. When do you do the charge? So you've got to weigh all those things, take them into account, into consideration. They're critical, they're very important. You can't just ignore them and think that that you are acting as if when you stay somewhere in heaven and not stay in South Africa. No, you must take those things into consideration. They're important. I mean, I'll take you. Let me take you into my confidence and tell you some of the things which we got to know about. It's a pity that Comrade Zola Square is now late. Zola was the minister who was acting at the time, just before the conference. He was the acting minister of justice, because Bridget had attended a conference in Italy. So one Saturday he calls me and says, he just heard that there's a group of MK people that is assembling in Soweto. They've just picked up the story that Zuma is about to be arrested, just before the conference. And he's been informed that this is what is happening. And he asked me if I know anything about it. So I tell him, no, I don't know anything. Go and call the people, the relevant people. And he says, no, man, I don't know those people. Will you call them? I said, no, I think it would be important that you phone them. So these conversations are taking place in the context of that background, that I think it's important that some of you should know. Okay.
Ngoma, there's a question I think you wanted to pose, a further one.
Yeah, so building with this logic, I asked the question of how far one pushes it. So for example, if I took that principle about public interest, then it follows that there may be calls never to prosecute people at all. I guess. Well, I mean, this one was the case. So armed with the consequences of the imprisonment of Jacob Zuma, ultimately, on different grounds, the riots that took place, would you have ordered, if you were among the justices of the Constitutional Court, would you have been among the ones who were dissenting on his imprisonment, or among the ones who, because I mean, I think there needs to be clarity on this question of at what stage the political and public consequences become.
Let me explain. The first thing that you have to weigh in is whether you have sufficient evidence for you to prosecute. That's the first thing. Regardless of whatever the public policy is, if you have evidence that an offense has been committed and is sufficient for you to get a conviction, you charge. There's no doubt about that. There's no manga business there. The issue of public interest comes in when you do not have now sufficient evidence. You begin to say, do I go and take the risk of charging these people when I am not certain that I will get a conviction? What damage is that going to do to the country? You weigh all those issues, and then you say, this is not in the public interest for me to proceed when I'm uncertain. I would have convicted if I was a judge in that matter. I would have been one of those, because it was absolutely critical that no one is above the law, that you don't defy the orders of the courts. I would have, even if there was going to be riots all over the country, I would have convicted.
I think I am. I keep on calling you because there's a person on the screen with that. Ongs, are you? I think you are clarified as far as this question is concerned. I want to move to perhaps an issue of which, I mean, you don't name it as such in the book, but I think it's hugely important: disinformation and the disinformation campaigns that are normally directed at particularly the certain public institutions and the people who lead them, particularly those who would have us believe, of course, that they're really trying to rebuild, and all of that. You went through probably some of the worst accusations. I mean, you mentioned earlier being accused of being an apartheid spy and all of that. And I know, subsequent conversations then, I know Mo Sheikh had at some point apologized, etc. But if you were to look at the current lay of the land at this stage, one of the most difficult things, I think, is that our institutions are operating in an environment where there's such a huge trust deficit between, institutions themselves and the public at large. At your time, you did have some confidence. In fact, I think if I read in the book, you had quite a good public confidence from various quarters, particularly ordinary people. The circumstances, I would argue now, are slightly different. So in your view, how would you, if you were to talk to Shamila Batoy or anybody who's leading a institution of accountability, operating at this time where there's very, very little trust in the institutions themselves, I mean, how would you, really advise them to go about trying to rebuild not only the institution itself, but also rebuild in that environment where there's such a big trust deficit?
Yeah, it's a tough one. You know what people want to know is that those who commit offenses are being prosecuted and punished. That's what people want. It's as simple as that. So if Shamila and them, indeed, you are absolutely correct. There's this trust deficit throughout the country, in institutions, in people everywhere, even in our leaders, But all they have to do is to prosecute those people who have been already identified, for example, in the Zondo Commission. We know these offenses were committed in full view of the public. And so far, we have not seen a single one wearing these orange overalls. That's what will instill confidence in the public, is to see that the offenders are now facing charges before the courts. That's all. You must expect that, they must expect, of course, that people are going to fight back, and particularly those who don't have a defense. They're going to be fighting one, they're going to fight the process instead of focusing on the merits of the case. They're going to be challenging the process. After the process, they're going to be attacking the prosecutors themselves. They're going to try and find as much data as possible on them, and they're going to throw it at them so that they can divert attention from them. That thing is going to happen. It comes with the territory, and you just can't avoid it. is going to be there. But as long as they can be focused and do what they have to do. One of the things that we did, which I think is important for them, I mean, we introduced this Hollywood style of arrest of people. And that helped a great deal, by the way, in instilling fear in the people, in the criminal. Some of the people will call me and say, please, Mr. Ngcuka, whatever you do, when you want me, just phone me, I will come. I don't want to be arrested in front of the cameras, in front of my children. Whatever you do, just come and tell me. I will come and present myself. Now, that worked. So you have to devise some strategies where you satisfy the public, and the people will give you a benefit of doubt after some time.
I would imagine, though, I mean, you talk about the Hollywood style arrest, and I think us in the media obviously get very excited when that kind of thing happens. But I mean, I would imagine that you can't just go Hollywood without having all your ducks in a row. And part of perhaps the trust deficit that I talk about is that even now, if we see a Hollywood style arrest and we get our hopes up, and then literally nothing happens, whether it is because the case is postponed, whether it is, but it sometimes appears as though the NPA is not ready. So I'm just putting it, I suppose, to you. Maybe you can comment on it. It's just to say, of course, you must have your ducks in a row. The NPA would have us know, would tell us that some of these cases are quite complex, and this is why we are unable to, they're not really low-hanging fruits at this stage, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the cases, yes, of course, are in the courts, and we can appreciate that. But it's just really about having your ducks in a row, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. But I'll tell you, I mean, this is what I've been telling the guys, and something that we did. In the past, we'll investigate a person. Sometimes we'll bring 1,000 charges. And I would ask the guys, okay, you're investigating this case, you've taken 2 years to do the investigation, you're going to bring 1,000 charges. What is the likely sentence the person is going to get? And they will say, well, he'll get 20 years or so. I said, okay, that's fine. If you bring 10 charges, what is he going to get? He still gets 20 years. So why must you continue to investigate ad nauseum? Focus. You can take, for example, just to give you this case that has been going on and on and on and on, of this fellow from Stellenbosch, who, I forget now this case. The guy was this case that was also listed in Netherlands and so forth. I just forget the name now. It will come back to me. That case has been going on, I don't know, it's 3-4 years or so. By now, that fellow should have, sorry?
Marcus Jooste case.
Yes. That case should have been in court long ago. There is no reason why that fellow has not been charged. You don't have to prefer, as I say, 1,000 charges against him. You can cobble up 5 or 10 or 15 counts, and you'll still get the same sentence. Those are the things that cause people to lose confidence in the system.
I was precisely going to say, and the danger, of course, particularly with his case, the danger, of course, is that it fuels the narrative that only some people get charged in this country, whereas others don't. I know we're running out of time. I think we've got about 10 or so minutes to go. I do want to take the questions that I see on the chat and pose them to you. The one question from Debogo, he says, what do you make of the fact that decades after the TRC had recommended prosecution of those who didn't get amnesty, none of those have been brought to book? Any comment on that?
Yes. Unfortunately, I left the NPA in 2004. I had set up a process whereby I given instructions to the team that had set up that where there's evidence, you must prosecute. And so one of the cases that the guys were doing at the time was one of Nivot was involved in the murder of a number of people in Port Elizabeth. Unfortunately, he died before he could be brought to court. I'm aware that there are some of the TRC cases that have not been prosecuted, but unfortunately, I'm not privy to what has happened since I left. But my instructions were very clear that where there's evidence, you must prosecute. And I created a special team to do the TRC cases.
In fact, in the book, you do mention, and I'm just trying to recall as I'm listening to you, do mention, I mean, there were narratives that, seem to suggest that were part of the stalling had to do with perhaps some ANC, ANC leaders at the time who were stalling the process, I suppose, in trying to make sure that the ANC is not, and you saying that in your time, at least, there was never any political interference.
No, nothing.
All right. The other question I do want to take from Dennis. Dennis says that he heard you allege during a radio interview that the NPA was in the past 10 years captured, and he's asking you to please elaborate on that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, the decision that was taken firstly not to charge Zuma on the basis of that conversation, when in fact Moshe knew that he's the one who had taken the decision. So that in itself is evidence of that. And all the time they fought tooth and nail to ensure that they don't charge Zuma for all the time that Zuma was the president. You can ask yourself the question: who of all these people who were involved in the Gupta Gate, who has ever been prosecuted in the last 10 years? Nobody. There's not been a single high-profile corruption trial that has taken place in this country. And that must tell you, see.
And Marion, is there any comment perhaps you want to have on this, particularly around, what is the conversation, perhaps let me ask this way, what is the conversation in your activism role? What are the conversations happening in your circles really about what the NPA was in the last 10 years and whether or not it really can be rebuilt into the institution, a modern prosecution institution that we need at this stage?
I must say first that I haven't been at the NPA during the past 10 years, so that puts me at a disadvantage. However, I think the point is, as already been mentioned, and as Shamila has emphasized, that it really has, the NPA by all accounts has been or was reduced to a shadow of what it was. Can it be rebuilt? Yes, of course it can be rebuilt. The book goes into some detail, Bulelani goes into some detail in the book about what it took to build the NPA. There was no national prosecuting authority. There were, provincial or independent attorney generals, I think 11 of them throughout the country, including those in the various Bantustans. And so there was essentially no national prosecuting authority. And there were other new institutions that had to be built, like the Scorpions, like the Asset Forfeiture Unit, etc. And if you just look at the Asset Forfeiture Unit, that didn't take off. That was exciting new legislation, but it was an incredibly difficult, long process with lots of defeats along the way before the unit was really performing, and it performed extremely well. So yes, it can certainly be rebuilt. I think the difficulty when you talk of the conversation in activist circles, everybody is impatient, and understandably so. Everybody wants to see people in orange overalls, wants to see high-profile cases. The only thing that, having been at the NPA in the past and having seen to some extent the kind of very careful thinking that had to go into decisions about when and whether to prosecute and how to manage political risk, as has been mentioned, is that is something that the NPA will need to manage, that whilst they are under pressure to prosecute, that at the same time, one can only imagine what a hasty decision taken simply to satisfy public pressure, and a case collapses, what would that mean in the bigger scheme of things? And so yes, there's huge risks that Shamila Batoy and her leadership at the NPA have to take. I believe they can take it. I believe as a South African public, we are going to have to be a bit patient. People say, well, it's been 3 years or 5 years. when you look at the kind of cases they have to take on, they're not easy cases, but I believe that we will get some of the justice that is required in the country.
Can I just add something there, Sis? I think that, I've been saying this, that I'm cautiously optimistic that the NPA is on the right track. I think that Shamila has managed to bring in some of the good people who used to be there. For example, they've just appointed Anton du Plessis to be one of the deputy directors of public prosecutions. Anton was there during my time and left to go and work for the Institute of Security Studies, and then went to work at the Security Council in New York. He's just come back from the Security Council, come back to South Africa to join Shamila there. They brought Omar Rabachi from the private sector back into the asset forfeiture unit. And they've taken Rodney, who was the DPP in Cape Town, brought him to run the NPS. So I think it's beginning to see the team that is quite competent and credible. So I am hopeful that we're going to see some good things in the near future.
And in the meantime, what are you doing? I mean, there's a question, by the way, and I said I would ask Marion this question earlier, which is that somebody expressing some disappointment that the book doesn't really go much about your life after the NPA. What are you busy with now?
Okay, two things. We initially, we had to cut, we probably had about 600 pages, and the publishers told us, that's too much. People don't read that much, you must cut. So at some stage we had to cut. So that one has to wait for this second book, hopefully. But right now I'm working, I'm in the private sector. I work for a company called Vua Investments. I'm the executive chairman of that company. We have a diversified portfolio, and I sit on a couple of boards. I chair some of the boards. Prominent among those would be City Lodge Hotels. I chair that. I do a couple of things. I'm running back home. We have a partnership with the University of Fort Hare where we've got a dairy project. We're milking cows there, where you see when you go home. I'm involved in that project. I'm the chairman of that dairy project. So I'm doing a couple of things. I'm still very busy.
Sabella, Marion, are you going to nag him of a book, or are you moving on to someone else and writing about them next?
There are other books already in progress, but I think the important point also is that that writing about one's life, whether it's a biography or autobiography, requires some reflection. And Bulelani is still a young person. And as he says, who knows, maybe there is going to be a volume 2 dealing with life after the NPA. For our present purposes, or certainly from my standpoint, it was important. Everyone was talking about this man who took this decision and debating his decision. For me, it was important for him to be able to talk about his decision himself, but also to give some insight into who is this man, what was his life before he was appointed the national director. And one can debate at when is the right time, to write a biography or autobiography. I think this was the right time to take the story up till the present day, and then we'll see what, as Bulelani says, maybe there's a volume 2.
Thank you very, very much. Ongama, in 30 seconds, my friend, any last thoughts just about the book?
So I think in a word for me to professionals out there, there's still space for contributing and following a professional track. I don't want to lose that from the book. For every Griffith Mklenge, there is somebody I could identify in my personal life who became, a point of motivation. So this is to encourage people out there who may not see greater than their own personal development at first, that in fact, at some stage, it actually influences the systemic. So let's keep at it. In the theory about revolutions and stuff, we do feature somehow. So let's keep at it.
Thank you very much, Ongama. Mr. Ngcuka, thank you so much. I think I want to end this with you. Perhaps I started it off on a personal note for you. I want to end it on a personal note for you. You speak very fondly of Mrs. Ngcuka in the book, and perhaps you just want to share with us in a few seconds, just really, her and her role, in the life that you've had, and really the partnership that you guys have had, which is very unique in many instances. What do you have to say to her at this point?
No, thanks very much for that. You know, when I was in jail, she wrote me a note and said, now that you are in jail, I am your mother, I'm your father, I'm your partner, I'm your brother, I'm your sister, I'm everything to you. So don't be embarrassed to ask anything from me. And that has been our relationship throughout. She's been indeed a very loyal and dependable ally. She's been through some tough times, you know, sometimes, particularly when I was going through all these allegations of me being a spy and everything else, you know. She will come home and say, but why are people praying for me? And I would say, why? She said, no, somebody called me and says, I'm praying for you. Why are they praying for me, you know? So throughout that time, I mean, she really stood up for me. You know,
absolutely. No, absolutely. Thank you so much.
That's why I love it.
We see that. We see that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Marion, thank you for putting pen to paper and really recording a remarkable part of our history. Ongama, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. It really was an important one for us at the Sowetan to have. And I think for anybody who's joining us on any platform tonight, we want to say thank you for borrowing us your time. There are more conversations to be had. Look out for them on sowetanalive.co.za. To my guest, Diabulela Kakhulu, thank you very much. And here's to more conversations happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sisi.